Hi guys, I'm Maylin Dovan, certified athletic therapist and founder of Rehab-U Movement and Performance Therapy. Welcome to our YouTube channel. This week we're going to talk about hypermobile hip, and yes, that can cause pain. Now, we typically work a lot with people who are hypomobile. We're used to working with people who need range of motion, who are lacking hip mobility. But let's face it, the opposite, the hypermobile hip, can be just as bad. Now, some athletes who have hypermobile hips, they kind of find themselves in a sport that requires a lot of mobility in the hips, right? It's kind of like a natural selection, but they can still get themselves into trouble. Hey guys, thanks for watching our videos, and don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel. For example, in golf, there's really a lot of excessive and intense rotational torque that goes on in the hips. And a lot of the times you'll find that golf athletes have a lot of hip range of motion. That's what I mean by the natural selection. They've wound up being good at golf because they have a lot of hip range of motion. But as I said, sometimes that can get them into trouble. So let's talk about how we manage a hypermobile hip, because it can be trickier to manage than the hypomobile hip. We're used to mobilizing stuff and creating some space and things like that. Because what happens with the hypermobile hip is that now these athletes may be getting into excessive impingement. And remember, hip impingements, like getting into a position of impingement with some hip flexion and hip internal rotation, that's kind of a natural position in sports. A little bit like when we talk about shoulder impingement. It's physiologically normal to have impingement, but what we don't want is for it to become excessive, right? That can make it irritable, and there are factors that can contribute to that becoming excessive. So in this case, if we have athletes who have a hypermobile hip, they have a lot of hip internal rotation, they have very little stiffness in that hip, they may be getting into excessive positions of impingement or have trouble controlling that end range of motion, and that may cause hip pain, and that may get them into trouble. So let's look at what we would do with this hypermobile hip. How do we intervene? So where do we start with this hypermobile hip? So the hypermobile hip definitely doesn't need range of motion. It's got plenty of range of motion. In fact, one could argue it's got too much range of motion. So really what it needs is motor control. So we need to work on awareness and dissociation. So what we could do is work on torso, on pelvis dissociation. So we're going to get our athlete into a leaned over position, and then what we're getting him to do is just turn his torso, but keep the hips really stable. So we don't want him to completely follow through and let, like he would in for example, a golf swing. We don't want him to follow through. We want him to just stop where he's got to push into rotation but keep the hips stable, and he can go both sides. So really what that's creating is when he's rotated here and he's keeping those hips stable, he's really creating like an anti-rotation for those hips. They've got to create just enough stiffness to allow the solid base, the fixation point, for him to turn his torso. So we're really working on getting him that awareness, and we're really working on those deep muscles of the hip and that kind of anti-rotation component, which we typically work on in stability in an activation sequence. But in the case of a hypermobile person, that dissociation and that awareness is part of creating proprioception, and so part of a mobilization sequence for this person. Next, we want to work on strengthening the elements that contribute to having that strength in internal rotation, right? So you're thinking anti-rotation exercises, and absolutely we're going to do anti-rotation exercises. We're just going to make them really challenging because we've got someone who has a hypermobile hip, and we really need that anti-rotation exercise to create a lot of demand in that hip. So we're going to use this banded anti-rotation exercise. So we're working on the left hip. So he's hooked the band on his right shoulder, and the band is pulling him into rotation. So he's keeping his torso square, and then he's going to stand on that left hip. Now, because he's pulling his torso towards that left hip, really to resist that rotation, that left hip is really working in internal rotation to resist the pull of the band, pulling his torso towards the right. Okay, so band hooked on the right shoulder, pulling the torso towards right rotation, so he's working left torso rotation, getting that hip to work in internal rotation. Now we could do holds here for time, 20 seconds, 30 seconds, 2 to 3 sets. So there are a couple of ways in which you could start to create some of that deep hip stability to control that joint hypermobility, right? So creating that awareness and dissociation, and then creating that anti-rotation element, so strengthening that internal rotation of the hip. Now, we wouldn't stop there because obviously we're gonna also have to have rotational efficiency. We're gonna have to have good quality load distribution after that so that the person can load that hip in a rotational way without getting excessive impingement. So there's more to it than what we do to start to create that stability, but that'll come in another video. So if you haven't already, make sure you subscribe to the YouTube channel.